The proof is in the poop. That's my slide whenever I talk to people like, yeah, this guy's full of it. I already know it. He literally talks shit for a living. And he just mentioned a cow horn, and he mentioned planets, and then I lost him. So I don't know what. And I'm like, good. You know what? Take your 400x microscope. Take this off to the lab. You can do a biological assay, you can do a nutritional assay, you can do planting tests, you can do characteristics, you can do full spectrum chromatography, you can do any kind of analysis you want. Proof is in the poop. So go do it and come back and then be like, well, that's the best shit I've ever seen. How do you do it? So now we can talk. Maybe your mind will crack open a little bit, maybe not. So understand, when you're building your pile, fundamentally, you play a role in this. You're the composer. This is the whole idea. It's decomposition of breaking down, and it happens all around us. Anytime you just walk outside and look at a tree, you're seeing nature doing composting, okay? And it's all of these life processes taking place in one pile in your backyard. So let's get into it. What do you have locally? It's the easiest place to start. What do you have locally? And when you think local, you want to think first your own farm. Maybe you got a backyard. In that case, you want to think about your neighbors. What's your own mini ecosystem? There's the ecosystem on your property. There's the ecosystem kind of in your neighborhood or your valley or your mountaintop, whatever your living situation is. Your larger kind of town that you live in, and then, you know, we've got much bigger ecosystems. But this is one of kind of those things where somebody's got chickens and somebody's got ducks and somebody's got sandy soil and somebody's got clay soil, and you guys just all kind of got to get together and figure it out. But start with what you have locally. What can you supplement on site? Is there something that's just great for compost that you could actually grow on your farm? Maybe there's something that you want to use that you could feed to your chickens. And then you can harvest your chicken manure. Now you've upcycled other nutrients as a feed source and through the chicken, and now it's going into the compost, and then it hits the plant. What can you grow or generate, which what I was doing, and what does your soil need? And that's the most fundamental thing. It is, if anybody's looking at building your soil and you haven't spent a minimum of $75 to test it, you either have a soil PhD and you've done a lot more, or you're probably gonna waste way more than 75 bucks trying to get it right, doing it wrong, and fixing problems. What's gonna be your personal relationship? Do you honestly have time for this, right? Is this something you can maybe get excited about? And I'm not the only person who gets excited about compost, okay? We got a support group, we get together, you know. Equipment limitations. Are you one man, one pitchfork, okay? Do you have a small tractor? Do you have a skid steer? Do you have a landscaper that comes in that sometimes he's got a piece of equipment that he hauls around from job to job, but you've just never really bothered to think about it? Based on that, you can kind of formulate where you're gonna go. How are you gonna monitor and test it? And don't think that's super complicated, okay? Because I've spent money on every single moisture meter under the sun, and the best thing you can ever do is a squeeze test. Variations on your theme, and that's, you know, this is when we get into it, is you're composing. So, you know, go crazy with it. So compost happens. Obviously, it's this thing that happens. You have aerobic activity, vapor, CO2. It goes through a thermophilic process. That's the fancy name for when it's hot. And then it goes into this kind of mesophilic process where you have this additional decomposers that come along. And then, you know, a good compost kind of wants to stabilize and mature and get ready for use. If it's too early, it's got that ammonia smell that you might find. But compost has energy. There's literally stored energy in compost, and you can see it manifest itself. So there you have the mesophilic, the thermophilic, you know, curing and maturation. There's a lot of composting basics that can get into that. But essentially, your first things are breaking down a lot of your starches, and then you'll see a lot of stuff when you look in your pile and you see all that white. That's the actinomycetes. They love the surface area. Now here's a good thing to remember is if they love the surface area, the more surface area they have, the better. So sometimes rather than real big things, sometimes you can rent a chipper, right? You can just rent a chipper from the guy down the road, and you can get a smaller particulate matter. But you don't want to get too small because remember, your pile needs porosity. We'll get into that. So the soil food web, right? Anytime people are like, okay, I saw this, is this good? It's funny, sometimes I run into a gardener who has just a wonderful, to some person it might look like a jungle, to other people are like, that's a balanced ecosystem. And it's like, no matter what they have in there, they're like, yes, it's good. Now it's good not in excess, like many things can be terrible in excess. So you want to balance it, but this And these are whole classes and training. Do we have any soil food web experts, Elaine Ingham disciples in the house? No. Shocker. It's okay, I won't pick on you. Think about what it's gonna be used for. A lot of times that can play a key role. If you have edibles, we might be talking about developing different composting systems. If you have a lot of just fruit trees or shrubs or things like that, you know, the time, the equipment, what you're growing comes down. What can you get easily? Again, you see, I keep sliding in here. How much time and energy do you have to devote to your compost? So if it's not that much time, we'll figure out a simple system. If you got a little more time and this kind of excites you, then we'll just go from there. Space as well, drainage and maneuvering. What's the slope of the land? Are you in a wet zone or are you in a dry zone? Is there shelter? Does it get too wet? Community composting. This goes back again, not only for collecting feedstocks among your community, but sometimes there's a community garden. Maybe sometimes somebody has extra space and you can like be able to be a responsible gatherer of compostable materials and then share in the good results for them. So some of this stuff is a little, we'll get into it, but essentially you're looking at mixing it. So this is the food for your pile, carbon, nitrogen, and you want a carbon-nitrogen ratio. So you can't just have one thing or the other. You got a carbon-nitrogen, this is for your starting ratio. Again, for beginner people, don't get overly intimidated. You can go online and there's some great compost calculators. It'll tell you a list of like 150 most popular household type of compostable materials. It'll tell you what the pH is, what the bulk density is, if it's more carbon, if it's more nitrogen. You can kind of like, again, start with what you have the most of and work from there, and work with the basics and figure out a recipe that's gonna work for you. Again, drainage, you don't want it with a high bulk density or it can't necessarily go through. So selecting your ingredients, you got your nitrogenous materials around. Everybody should be hoarding carbon right now. You're gonna have a lot of wetter materials and food scraps. Those are easy to come by. Summertime is hoard your carbon and get it ready for stuff. Water, this is again another thing. Your pile needs to be above 40% moisture and less than 65% moisture to kick off. But ideally you want it just below 60, 65% there. You don't want it to dry out too quickly, and you don't want it to be too wet to begin with, otherwise the pile can't breathe. That's where you can get more fungal activity. You have a lot of different dust problems. It takes a little longer. A lot of people battle with this. So you have little tools that are available. Micro sprinklers are great in a climate like this in the winter or in the summertime. Sometimes where you have a lot of rain, you might even want to tarp or cover your pile with something that'll kind of still allow it to gas off. There's some really great compost covers you can buy. And again, if you're going to invest in this, if this is a resource, compost is a resource for your garden, you're investing in your compost and your soil health, and you want to build it so it's better next year, and you're depositing in it every single year. So if you're looking at it that way, you're continually adding to it, and you're looking at kind of exactly how you can balance it. There's ways that you can harvest wetter materials to keep the piles going. You can put straw. What I've done this summer is I've put straw. I built big piles and put straw and kind of just let it sit for 30 days to ride out the heat wave, and then put it in windrows and get it going, you know, aerobically, and turn it and fire it up. So porosity, again, and bulk density, that's because the pile needs to breathe. You can't have too much water, can't have too little water. And here's the fire. So you have all these different components, earth, water, air, and fire, and that's the temperature. Simplest rule of thumb is you need about a cubic yard of material to really get any temperature, okay? So that's 3 foot wide, 3 foot high, 3 foot deep, okay? If you could have one of the circular composters, very simple system is a 3-pallet system, or you can build 2 different bins. Once one of them is finished, you can start putting your materials in the other and turn the first pile and really get it down a little ways. But just remember, you need a decent sized collection of material, otherwise you're not really gonna get the temperatures. And if you're not getting higher temperatures and it's slower decomposition, it's okay. You wanna just then figure out when you use that compost. Your greatest ally and when to use it is wintertime and the rains, and that's coming up soon. So there's a lot of different methodologies you can use to incorporate that compost, even if it's not finished where you'd like it to be. Maybe doing it in a lasagna style with a little cardboard on top, cover it up with something, plant a cover crop perhaps, something nitrogen fixing on top of it. But there's ways to try to use the cycle of winter to help break down that material in the garden for you if you kind of need to adjust it. The preparations are something that we add. You can buy them online. You can find local biodynamic groups that make preparations. Some people, especially in the biodynamic movement, make this part of the composting process sound all woo-woo and crazy. But the easiest way I like to explain it is think about it as biological components that are fermented, that are concentrated, that are broken down. So we see dandelion in the health food store. We know chamomile. We know the flower of the valerian plant. We know that stinging nettle is healthy for humans. It's super rich in silica. We know equisetum, which is the part of the horsetail plant, is also super rich in silica. It has an ability to regulate fungal diseases. So all of these components are biologically concentrated. And when I bury them in my pile and it's 135, 145 degrees, it's cooking, it's simmering. There's life in there, there's food in there, and a lot of those microbes, they reproduce and they grow and they go, and you're making a soil, again, that's kind of healthy for your plants, the same way we use plant compounds for our own personal health. There are some pictures of the preparations. This is another great thing. There's an organization called JPI, Josephine Porter Institute in Floyd, Virginia. They make the preparations. You can mail order them as small as 1 unit of each compound for your home compost pile, and they got a really nice graphic, and of course you can't see it. Here's the planting calendar. And this is where, again, it makes sense because this is a lot of indigenous wisdom. It's not like some crazy Austrian in 1924 was like, I got this all figured out. No, native tribes and people, this goes back to the Farmer's Almanac, which the Farmer's Almanac replaced religious wisdom, right, going back to monasteries and monks who would do all these different plant trials, but it's looking at this relationship of earth, water, air, and fire. And each one of those plants, right, is associated with either a fruit, a root, a flower, or a leaf. So almost any plant we can classify as either leaf, which is associated with water, right? So leafy greens are very influenced by watery elements. So it's looking at either when you can plant or when you work with these types of plants. Or for a vineyard, a biodynamic vineyard, and we're in wine country, they're gonna do their harvesting of their grapes on a fruit day. They're gonna do some of the other processing on a fruit day. If they're gonna do a foliar spray, maybe it's just like an annual foliar spray that they do, they're gonna look for a leaf day, where things that are taken in underneath the stomata of the leaf are taken in by the plant, but that part of the plant is more stimulated because more of the watery plants are aligned up. Same way you see sap or moon or anything like that. It makes sense, right? And you can take it to a whole nother level, and but a lot of this came from just people watching things, and that's why there was this conventional wisdom. On the Feast of St. Stephen, you plant this or that, right? And if this isn't done by the saint this or that, because every day was associated with a saint. And the monks in the churches where they did meticulous study of herbs and vegetables would pass on wisdom to the king, pass it on down to all the farmers. That's where their plant wisdom kind of came from. And then two things happened. We had the kind of the age of reason that kind of crushed all this religion out of everything. Plus, you know, we got 365 and a quarter days. So over time, like, some of these things didn't quite line up or have the same kind of potency, but you get the idea that a lot of this, there's a great book. Anybody read Culture and Horticulture? Wolf Storrell. Great book, Culture and Horticulture. Just good read, kind of talking about how these things blend together. So this kind of goes back to the fun thing. There's a picture out at Benziger Vineyards taking a look at their biodynamic compost, but they ultimately see that biodynamics works. It's able to balance it. It balances out whether it's a clay soil and it's breaking it up. You know, clay's a decent kind of soil. There's a lot of trace minerals and elements, but it's a problem of structure. It's like this, and you want to get it like this. Same thing with sandy soils. You want to build that so you can have the water retention. In the farm, they see it. They see that it lasts longer on a shelf. But one of the unique things about biodynamics is this idea of terroir. And it's not unique to biodynamics. It's the concept. Terroir is the sense of place, the sense of taste. It's that subtle, unique expression of that soil type. So if we're growing grapes or anything else with a flavor profile like that, the grapes right here might have different characteristics than the grapes over there, because there might be subtle differences. And what you're really looking to do is kind of try to enhance the uniqueness of that existing soil. And that comes down, and there's a lot of people who know a lot more about growing greens and plants and vegetables than I do. But you'll see that people say, where do you live? Well, we're in an area where, salmon swam up the rivers, and a lot of crustacean material, So if you're going out and you're buying a big jug of blood meal and pouring it on your plants, it's not what the soil around here is used to. Are you able to find an oyster shell, a crab meal, a shrimp meal, a fish meal, a kelp meal? Look for crustaceans. Organic biodynamic is always one of those things, people really kind of like to get into it. And a lot of times on a purely scientific level, under exacting same conditions, this, that, and the other, a lot of times you can say, well, there's no necessarily discernible differences, maybe something different with a Brix meter or this. Then if you have a year of stress or disease, that's when things kind of change a little bit, and biodynamic tends to be stronger because you're looking at building the plant's immune system and the overall health of the ecosystem around it. Biodynamics looks at the fact that there's energies around us. It influences nature. Minute doses of things can have a far-reaching effect, whether it's in something like a soup or a compost pile when you're adding small compounds. We hear a lot about how negative biological materials can cause harm. It's the same kind of thing you're looking at about how can we do this in a positive manner. Another assumption of biodynamics is plants are inherently intelligent. And even 7, 8, 9 years ago when I'd say that to people, that's when I'd see the glaze go over. But I think kind of people get it, right? Plants can kind of figure out how to grow anywhere. And it wasn't a bad acid trip, but I remember standing somewhere in a brick alley in Brooklyn, New York, and seeing a dandelion like 6 feet off the wall. And I'm like, how are you growing here? Like, I don't want to even live in this neighborhood. And you've just kind of figured out, how to drop a root down 6 inches, hang a hard left, go over, move something there. There's a little drip that comes down off somebody's air conditioning against the wall, whatever. You're a dandelion and you figured out how to survive, right? So understanding that plants kind of have an ability to sense their environment. You give them what you need. I mean, it's one of the biggest things is the amount of nutrients that get wasted in this country on a small scale and on a large scale are just absolutely mind-boggling. They're resilient and they're adaptable. Like any wetland system, anything like that, they'll work. And nature knows best. You see it whether it's biomimicry and it's engineering how a train goes into a tunnel by looking how a bird, enters the water, and they're not able to produce that sonic boom. Like, we see it all around us. I love wetlands because if you just let them breathe, you reestablish the ebb and flow, whether it's a train track or something that cut it down. Wetlands have this ability to restore themselves.